Hello everybody, this is Johns Hopkins with Baltimore Heritage, and we're back with another of our 5-Minute Histories videos. And today I'm at First and Franklin Presbyterian Church here in Mount Vernon, and I know you know this church. My friend and historic church researcher Bill Dunn says that at 273 feet, this is the tallest spire in the city. But we are not here to talk about architecture today. We'll have to come back. The church has fantastic architecture. We're here today to talk about the church's role in the early fight against AIDS. I'm thrilled to be joined by John McLucas, who has been part of that effort for a number of years with the LGBT community and First and Franklin communities, where probably the first support group for HIV/AIDS patients and their loved ones was held 40 years ago this year. But before I turn it over to John, let me just say a few words about the early days when AIDS was hitting America and Baltimore in particular, to give some sense of the speed that it hit. In 1981, there was something like 230 known cases of HIV/AIDS. By 1987, there were 40,000 here in the United States. In 1981, the word AIDS wasn't even really used, or at least commonly used. It was often called GRID, the gay-related immune deficiency syndrome. And one of the issues was that this disease did hit the LGBTQ community hard, but there was an enormous stigma associated with it. It wasn't until 1982 that the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, confirmed that the disease was not limited to any one community, but it took activists to help break down those barriers and that stigma. Here in Baltimore, one of those activists was a gentleman named John Steuben. He had moved from New York in 1987, the same year that an organization called ACT UP, AIDS, let me get it right, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, was formed. He formed a local chapter of that and recruited a number of colleagues that were very active and very activist. They did things like send a coffin to City Hall, chain themselves to the doors of the health department, all in order to share some sunlight on the AIDS disease and what was happening out here in the streets of Baltimore. On the medical front, in the 1970s, late 1970s, a group got started as a gay men's health clinic. That group is Chase Brexton. We did a video on that with them a few weeks ago. Check that out. But their medical director was a doctor named Bernie Branson. And in the early 1980s, a number of his patients were coming to him with what would then be known as HIV/AIDS. In his waiting room, he formed what was probably the first support group for HIV/AIDS patients and their loved ones. It outgrew his waiting room and found a welcoming home here at First and Franklin. That group was called the Health Education Research Organization, or HERO. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to John McLucas to talk a little bit more about the church and its early days of fighting against AIDS. John, we're all yours.
Well, thank you, Johns. I'm John McLucas, as you said. I'm an elder in First and Franklin Presbyterian Church. When I joined the church in 1985, it already had a history of advocacy and support around lesbian gay issues, as we said at that time. In January of 1980, 5 years before I joined, the church had gone on record as a more light church, that is, a church which actively welcomes lesbian and gay people into full participation, which put the congregation at risk of the national church repossessing the buildings and the endowment and dissolving the congregation, because the national denomination did not recognize lesbian and gay people as well, frankly, as people. So when I moved to Baltimore in 1984, and the word on the gay street was that First and Franklin was welcoming to gay people, that was true. I, in fact, was ordained in the fullness of time as deacon and then elder. My ordination could at that time have been revoked by the national church or invalidated. The numbers of gay people rose quickly after I joined, in part because of the rising reality of the AIDS epidemic. As you referenced, Dr. Branson's support group for persons with AIDS met in the very room we're standing in now, what we call our chapel. And we had the first public forum on AIDS as a health issue in our sanctuary in 1983, again before I was here. Our pastor Harry Holfelder in 1985 became a founding member of the AIDS Interfaith Network, where ministers and rabbis would get together and talk about ways to support persons with AIDS and their loved ones, and also to advocate for the rights of lesbian gay people. For many years, maybe 15, we've kind of thought all those issues were solved. And we've rested a little bit on our progressive laurels because the position of lesbian, gay, LGBTQ people seemed pretty safe. Suddenly in 2023, we look around, there's Don't Say Gay laws being passed, trans legislators being silenced and expelled from their chambers. We need to get busy again. And First and Franklin is hosting from May 21st until June 30th some panels of the what's often called the AIDS quilt. Full correct title is the Names Project AIDS Memorial Quilt. It was started in 1985 as a memorial to persons who've died, and individual families and communities and people would make a quilt large enough to cover the grave of a loved one. And they would customize it to that person's personality and character. And they've been stitched together. Currently, the entire AIDS quilt weighs 54 tons, and it's the largest community folk art object in the world. Having the quilt here as one of this year's Pride activities is commemorating the 40th anniversary of the AIDS epidemic and those special events that were hosted in this church 40 years ago. I need to point out the panel hanging over my right shoulder commemorating Frank Osmond. When he died in 1990 as a beloved, active member of the church, it was a shared grief for the entire congregation. And as you can see, his lover chose the motto, "So easy to love." And it's needlework letters which were done by many, many people who loved Frank. You can see that Frank was a very handsome man. He was hilarious, he was kind, he was smart. One of my favorite Frank Osmond stories is that a couple days before his death, when he was very, very disabled by his AIDS symptoms, his doctors checked him for mental acuity and they said, "Frank, what's a word that begins with C?" And he winked and said, "Chardonnay." And that to me was like gay pride in a nutshell. So I'm glad to be able to remember Frank Osmond today. I really hope that a lot of you will come by the church to visit the quilt. It'll be open on a schedule that's a little flexible, but basically Saturdays and Sundays. And information is available on the church's website. We'll have a service open to the public, interfaith service, to commemorate the AIDS epidemic, ongoing as it is, and to allow people to be in the presence of the quilt. I think you'll find it very, very moving, very dynamic, and Chardonnay, very funny.